Okay, so now we can get started building the register page. And I like to work from the back end first and then to the front end. So let's go ahead and do that. And the first thing that we're going to need is Mongoose. So we already set up Mongoose to connect to the database, if you remember, in our main index file. So now all we need to do is build a model with Mongoose. And you can get that from their website. You go over to documentation, they have a sample right here. And so we're just going to use that. So let's create a folder called models. Inside of that model, I'm going to build user.js, and then I'm going to paste all that in here. And then just make some minor updates. So blog schema, I'm going to name this user schema. Now going back over to the Mongoose website, the way you can export is using this right here. So we'll just copy that and paste that at the bottom here. Now instead of having a variable, we can just directly type in module exports, and then we'll change this to what we have up here, which is user schema. Now this is just a sample, so if you want to keep that up, but I'm going to go ahead and delete all this and create my own values. I'm going to have a email type string required true, unique true, lowercase true, and then I'm going to do the exact same thing but with username, and then lastly I'm going to add a password. Alright, so then I'm going to create another folder called routes, and this is going to have our API, and then I'm going to create a file called authentication.js. And so since I exported this user model here, I can import it here. So I'll just name it user. Alright, and same thing, I'm going to invoke module exports. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass in the router, the express router, and then I'm going to return it. And that's how we return all of our API routes. Okay. So since we exported this now in our index, I can go ahead and import this. So I'll just name it authentication acquire. And then pass in the router. Now I haven't created that yet, so I'm just going to do that right below the express. Okay, and then over here where I have my middleware, I'm just going to add a new one. Say app.use, and then I'm going to say / authentication, and then pass in that new file. Alright, so let's go ahead and start to build the routes here. Now just remember we have email, username, and password. So that's what we're going to be expecting. So my route is going to be called, it's going to be a post request, and I'm going to name it register. Now you want to use post usually for routes that need to be secure with the data that you're passing, but generally speaking, if you want to create a new user or any kind of new document in the database, then it's best to use post. And then of course you're going to use delete to delete an entry, put to update an entry, and then get to retrieve one. Alright. And so first I'm just going to test this route by saying hello world, just to make sure that it's mapped correctly. Okay, then back over in the user model, don't forget to also pull in Mongoose up here. And then to also add Mongoose promise. And so what I like to use to test out my routes is a Chrome plugin called Postman. There's a few other ones out there like Arc, but Postman is a really popular one right now, and I'm just gonna go ahead and start this up and show you how this works. So basically what we do is we access the app through whatever port is set up for our server, which mine is 8080. And then I just go to this route and it should return hello world. So up here, I'll change this to post, and you'll remember that from right here. It's a post request. And then I'll just type in the localhost /. Now, don't forget, because I used, in the index file, I used /authentication. We have to use this for all authentication routes, and then /register. So it's going to look like this. Okay, so /authentication /register. Now I'm just going to hit send, and then you'll see there I get back hello world. So we know it's working, and we can continue. So now what we need is a package that can translate the body. So basically what that means is when users send a username, an email, a password from the front end, you need something on the back end to translate that. And so what we can use is Body Parser, and this is a node package, a middleware that's basically going to translate it for us into this into request.body, and then we can do whatever we want with it. Then npm install Body Parser. And so in the main index file, the server file, I'm just going to add that in here. Okay, and then back on the site, it tells you how to actually use this. And you basically just want to add it as an express middleware. I'm going to copy both of these. And then I'm just going to paste them here where the other middleware is. And you want to make sure you paste that before the routes. So just to be safe, I like to paste it at the very beginning of all the middleware. All right, so now we can specify what we want in this route, right? So what it's going to look like is like this. It's going to have body, is going to have the email, username, and then password. So this is what the user is going to send us. And so we want to check for all three of these to make sure that the user sent it. Otherwise, we send back an error. And so the way we do that is we can just say, if request.body.email is not true, then we'll respond with JSON. We'll say success false, message, you must provide an email. Else, and then I'm going to go ahead and send back hello world. So let's test this out. Hit that send button and you should get that error there. And so what you can do here in Postman at the top, you want to hit body, and then the second option, form URL unencoded, and that's coming from Body Parser. You can see that right here. So that allows us to use that now. And so this is the way this works. So this is JSON, and it's going to be key value pairs. Just like this, right? Success, false, message, and then the message. So we'll do the same thing. We'll say email, and then I'm just going to put a dummy email here. And then I'm going to hit send. And so now, since it detected there is a request body, we get that hello world there. And there's also another way to test this on the back end. And so what you can do is right before this hello world, just log to the console the request body. And then if you hit send again and you go to your terminal, you'll see here is our object email. Okay, so now let's search for the rest. So under this else, we'll say if request.body.username is not true, then we'll basically do the same thing. You must provide a username. Then now I'll put this here. So let's test that out. False, you must provide a username. So let's do the same thing. All right, and there you go. You get the hello world. Now, I like to do this just because it's a lot simpler to build this out rather than implementing the HTML. It allows you to test your API, make sure everything's working before you start building the front end. So last, I'll go ahead and do if request.body.password is not true, then I will send this error back. And so the purpose of this is because you do not want to start running your logic if you don't even have a complete user, right? If you don't have all the information you need, you don't want to start building the user for your database, right? You want to make sure first, so kind of like a filter. So I'm just going to test this last one to make sure that I get that error there. Okay, and there we go. So now that we have that, what we can do is actually build out our user. And also, if you go back to your console, this is what the entire objects look like. So then we can manipulate that. I'm going to delete that. We don't need that. So I'm going to go ahead and create the new user now. And so this is coming from the object here, the module that we imported up here. Okay, and then we can pass in an object here. And we'll say username. Actually, I'll just go in order here. Email is request.body.email. Username is request.body.username. And then password is request.body.password. And so what I like to do is I want to make sure that the email is lowercase, even though in our database here we have it set to lowercase true. I want to set that by default here. Okay, so I'm just going to add at the end of this some JavaScript methods, 2 lowercase. I'm going to do the same to the username. All right, that way everything is just uniform. And so once that's done, I can go ahead and save my user with .save. But what I need to do is I actually need to configure if any errors occur, right? So I'll pass in an error method. Then I'll say if there is any error, then return JSON, success, false, message, could not save user, error, and then I'll pass in the error message. Else, I'll just return the success as true, message, user saved. So let me go ahead and try to save my first user. Okay, so actually as I was filming this, I realized I made an error here. If you go back over to your database configuration, the way I have this set up, it's not going to detect this right here. So what we need to do is just get rid of it altogether and just plug in the name of the database as part of the URI. Okay, and that should work for you. Now, once you do that, you just want to restart your server and connect to the database and then try to save your user. I'm going to go ahead and head over to my database and make sure it did save, and then you'll see our user right there. Now you'll notice that the password here is not encrypted. So I want to go ahead and add that really quick, and what I can use is Bcrypt Nodejs. It's probably the most popular encryption tool for passwords right now for Node. So you can just click this first one right here. And then it's a really simple implementation method. And so let's go ahead and install that really quick. And so you want to add it in the user model. So just right here at the top, I'm going to add that. And so what I'll do is at the bottom here, I'm going to create a middleware, but for the schema. And so what it'll do is before any schema is saved, it's going to perform this middleware. And what this middleware is going to do is encrypt the password. All right, and so that's from right here. So let's go ahead and do that. And so to create the middleware, you just call the name of the schema .presave. Then we'll pass in next. And so I'll say if this password, or actually if this is modified password. So in other words, if the password field is not modified, then we don't need to run this middleware. Because remember, this middleware is going to run anytime the user schema is activated. So we don't want to run it if the password wasn't even modified. Okay. So if it isn't modified, what we'll do is we'll just return next. And then otherwise, then we can go ahead and run the encryption. So to do that, you just type in bcrypt hash. Then you pass in this password of the current user that's passing through here. Null. And then a function with air and hash. So that's going to generate the hash for us. If there's an error, then we can just return next with that error. Else, what we can do is say this.password, that's the current user, will assign that hash to them. And then finally exit the middleware. And so before I go on, I actually have to get rid of this arrow function here because this doesn't support that yet, so we'll actually have to use function for that. And so going back to Postman, you want to go ahead and generate a new email and a new username, and then hit send, and it should save it. And then go into your database and check the user and see if the password is encrypted, and you'll see right there that it is encrypted. Okay. But now that we have encrypted the password, we need a way to decrypt it, right? Or to compare passwords when users log in to make sure that it works. And so what we'll use is the same thing, Bcrypt. We'll use compare sync to do that. And so what you can do is create a new method for your schema. So just type in user schema.methods and then name your method. So I'll name it compare password. And so we'll just say return bcrypt.compareSync, pass in password, and then the current password. And so what that does, it's going to return true or false. So when the user logs in, it's going to pass in their password into this function. And then we're going to plug it into this method and then we're going to compare it to the actual user of the one that's in the database, compare the two, and return either true or false as being a match. All right, and so that's how we match up an encrypted password. All right, but we're not actually going to use this until we implement the login feature. What I like to do is I like to customize the error messages just to make it as user-friendly as possible. So what I'm going to do here is right now we only have one error message configured. I want to add more. So what I'll do for right now is I'm just going to log the error to the console so I can look at it. Okay, so in Postman, I'm just going to hit send again. Now you're going to get an error because we're using a username and email that already exist. Now if you go to your console, you'll see the big error message here, right? And it's a Mongo database error, Mongoose error. And it basically just tells you that, hey, this is a duplicate. Okay. Now, if you go down to the bottom here and look at the code, we can actually use this to guide our error here and send back a custom message, right? So let's do that really quick. So what we can do is we can say if error.code is equal to the one we just saw, which was 11,000, which is a duplication error, then we can go ahead and return a specific error that's more detailed on actually what went wrong, right? So we'll say username or email already exists. and then else we'll run the general one here. So now if you go back into Postman and hit send, you'll see now that we get this message rather than that big error message. Okay, so that's what we want to send back to the user, something readable, something user-friendly. Now you'll notice if you leave the email blank and say you type in a few spaces and hit send, it actually saves the user, and if you go into your database, you'll see right here it's empty. But up here we specified that the email must be true and that the username must be true. Well, it is, it's just empty, it's just a blank, right? So what we need to do is add validation on the back end here so that this doesn't happen. So the way you do that is you go back over to user model, and then above the schema, I'm just going to create some methods here, some functions. So the first one is going to be email length checker. Okay, you can name this whatever you want. Then we'll pass in the email that the user is trying to register. And so if there is no email, then we don't even want to run this check, so we'll just return false. Else we can go ahead and run the check. And so what we do is we say if email.length is less than, we'll say 5, or email.length is longer than 30, it's about reasonable, then we'll return false. Whoops, did not mean to make an array there. We'll return false, right? So here we're saying if the email doesn't exist, then return an error. And if it exists, but it's less than 5 characters or longer than 30, then return error. And then lastly, we can return true, meaning they passed our validation. And so down here, I'm actually going to create an array, and I'm going to name it email validators. And I'm going to pass in the validator that I just created, right? So to do that, I'll just type in validator, the name, email length checker, and then the message if it's not passed. So we'll say email must be at least 5 characters, but no more than 30. And then in the schema, we can actually add that. So at the end here, after lowercase, I'll say validate, and then pass in email validators. All right, so now let's see what happens when we try to register with a blank email. You'll see now that we get our validation error rather than it saving it. But same thing, we want something more user-friendly, so let's go back and customize that. Let's go back to the authentication. Now, if you look here, going back to the error, you can kind of break this down, right? So it's an error object, and then it goes down to errors, plural, the name of the field, and then the message. All right, so this is what that's going to look like. So down here we have the else error. We'll add another one. We'll say if error.errors.email is true, meaning the validation didn't pass for this one, then we'll respond with JSON saying success false. And then the message, we can set it to error.errors.email.message. And so actually I don't want to run any of these checks unless error.errors is true, right? So error.errors is only going to be true if validation on any of our fields are wrong, okay? And so there's no sense in running the checks for each field if no validation has failed, okay? So first check if any validations have failed, and then run the individual checks on each field, okay? And so down here at the bottom, if no validation fields have been missed, then this is our catch-all, general error here, right? So, and the idea is to create enough specific logic here so that this never gets returned, right? You have it just in case so that your application doesn't crash, but The idea is that your logic is so good and so specific that you catch basically every error that you can. That way your application is very user-friendly. So now if we go back into Postman and hit send again, we don't get that huge message. We get our custom one here that we created in the validator. All right. So now let's go back and do the same thing. I'm going to add one other validation. Now, the one that I want to add, basically, if you type in just something that's not a valid email and you hit send, it saves the user, and we don't want that. We want only valid emails to get through. So I'm going to create another one, and I'm going to say valid email checker. Same thing, pass in the email, and then I'm going to run my check. So very similar to the one above. Same thing, we don't want to run this checker if there is no email. So we'll return false if there isn't one. And then we'll run the check now if there is one. Now what we want to use is a regular expression. Now I'm not going to go into great detail about this if you want to research it on your own. But for right now I'm going to paste one that I got from the internet. And you can feel free to use. It's going to be in the description. And so what we do is we just type in const, and you can name this whatever you want. I'm going to say reg express or exp, and then new regular expression, and then in the parentheses you just pass in the actual regular expression. Now this seems like a lot of random characters and it probably doesn't make a lot of sense, but like I said, I'm not going to go into detail, but basically what this is doing is specifying all the characters that are required for this email. All right, exactly how we want it formatted, what letters, what symbols, length, everything. Okay, and so below it, what we're going to do is run a test to see if this email fits the criteria. And you do that by just typing in return reg exp.test and then pass in the email. And so this is going to return either true or false. If the email doesn't meet all the criteria that's in here, it's going to return false. If it meets it, true. All right, so then we just need to add that right here to our array. Must be a valid email. All right, now if you go back over to Postman and just try that again, you'll see now you get the must be a valid email. Okay, and then you want to try to actually create a valid one just to make sure. All right, and then you'll get that user saved there. So now let's go ahead and add a validator to our username. So right below these, I'm just going to create another one. I'll name this one username length checker. And so for this one, I'm going to say no less than 3 characters and no greater than 15. And it's the same thing. I'm going to create another regular expression. This one is a little bit simpler. It's just an alphanumeric. It's basically just saying letters A through Z lowercase, letters A through Z uppercase, and any numbers. Okay, and that's pretty much all I want for my usernames. So then I'll just return a test of the username. Okay, and then lastly, create my array. that says username validators. So I had 3 and 15, so let's say must be at least 3 characters, but no more than 15. Must be a valid username. Now I can change this to be a little bit more specific. I can maybe say username must not have any special characters or spaces, or you can just say special characters. That's self-explanatory. Okay, and you also want to check, you want to make sure you always specify what it is that you're validating here, because once this gets implemented to the front end, you might just get the error message, and it won't necessarily say what field. So you want to specify that in your actual message so that the users will automatically know, oh yeah, they're talking about the email or they're talking about the username. Because if these all look the same, then they might not know which field you're talking about. Okay, then we need to add this to our actual schema. Let's see, where am I here? Okay, right here. In the username, add validate username validators. All these validator definitions, you actually want to have them above the schema. I thought I did put it above, but I guess not. Otherwise, it won't be recognized. Oh, actually, I just realized instead of validate, this needs to be validator. Okay, so afterwards, then we need to go back and actually implement this side of the errors in the authentication file. So we'll just add an else here. And then we'll say if error.errors.username is true, then we'll just do the same thing. And since we're in here already, what we can actually do is just do the one for the password as well. So let's go ahead and do that. Now it should never get to this last else here, but we'll build an error response just in case. You don't want to leave any gaps in your logic. Okay, so now you want to go back to Postman and you want to add special characters into your username to test that out. And you should see that validation email there, error. Then put a valid one, but just put more than what we specified for the length, and you should get that length error there. All right, so let's go ahead and configure the last one, which is password. And let's go up here and do that. I'll say no less than 8 and probably no more than 35. Like I said, these files will be in the description, so you can just download or go to my GitHub page and just copy this directly. Or you can just do a simple Google search, just type in something like JavaScript password regular expression, and there's a lot of them out there. But I would also recommend just learning how to use them because they're actually pretty easy to generate. Right, and last. Okay, then we just add that here. All right, going back to Postman, let's go ahead and just type in a simple password. And let me change my username as well. Okay, and you should get the error of password must be at least 8 characters. And so what I want to do is I want to actually type in a valid password. But then I want to make it too long just to check the length. All right, and get that error. Then lastly, I'm going to check my actual valid password. All right, and then you should get user saved. And then you always want to verify that these users are actually being saved. Okay. And so now what we've done is we just made sure that any user that's saved in our database is formatted exactly how we want it to. Okay. All right. And before I end this, I want to actually go back to my success message. Instead of user saved, I'm just going to say account registered. Not a big deal. But that completes this part of the tutorial. And then in the next video, we're going to go ahead and build the registration form for the Angular page.